I'm John Diaz. I'm a staff technical marketing architect with VMware, and today I want to talk to you about the second pillar or second intent of self-driving operations, and that is optimizing capacity. So when customers look at becoming more efficient in how they use the resources that they have on premises, especially with an eye towards potentially migrating workloads into hybrid or public cloud, we want to give them kind of the same capability that maybe cloud providers have in terms of how are things being used in my environment and what is the cost associated with using those resources. Where may I have waste? How can I get better with that? So in terms of just raw capacity planning, the first place to go is this assess capacity, and this will look familiar. You know, the all data centers view will look familiar to you from the last demonstration. But again, you know, we have information about potential cost savings, and then we have indicators of, hey, I'm either out of overhead, or I'm out of resources, or I'm going to run out of resources within a given time frame.
Sure.
So let's. Yes.
One clarification, when we're talking data centers here, does this directly translate to vSphere data center construct?
It can relate to the vSphere. That's a great question. So some of these can be related directly to those constructs in vSphere. They can also be custom data centers where you take clusters from other vSphere data centers and combine them into one. It could be based on production versus dev versus, you know, something else. It could be based on SLA tiers, environment, those types of things.
So it could be a super collection of data centers, but it couldn't be a subset of physical data centers within a vSphere construct. I'm just trying to work out what the assemblage is here.
Yeah, so
to what I already understand in other contexts.
Yeah, so if you do nothing out of the box, it's going to be based on the vSphere. When you go to the vSphere web client and you have a data center, then that's how we'll group these. But you can subdivide using custom data centers and mix and match clusters from other vSphere data centers into one custom data center. I don't want to say virtual data center because we already use that word for something else, but it's, does that make sense?
Yeah, just that you also use the word data center for something else than
yeah.
You.
John, quick question.
Yes.
Where are you getting the costs from?
That's a great question. So the costs are actually coming from base rates that we build into vRealize operations, which you can modify. So we used to have a product years ago that did chargeback. It was vCenter chargeback was actually the name of it. And when you bought it and got it, it showed you no cost, right? You had to go and input the cost for what is my hardware costs, power, cooling, labor, software, all that stuff. And it was a big challenge for customers. So what we did is we said, look, we'll give you some base rates based on industry standards, okay? And you can use those or you can tweak them. And for a lot of customers, I was talking to Scott earlier, a lot of customers like, you know, I'm fine with these base rates because before I really had no idea what those costs were. At least this gets me in the ballpark. And then if you're showing this to a CFO or something and they're like, where's this number coming from? Then you can have a discussion about tweaking those numbers to be more realistic. Okay, does that help?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so let's look at our production data center, which has 0 days remaining. Obviously, in a bad state here. I've got 4 clusters that are, having some resource constraints. I've got potential cost savings. I've got some optimizations that can be done from the previous demo to maybe help relieve some of that stress. But if I go further down and I look at the various clusters that I have here, you'll notice a couple of things. By default, we use a demand model in vRealize operations. In other words, demand is how much of the resources or how much of CPU memory storage would a virtual machine like to use? If it had unlimited access to all the resources in the world, how much would it like to use? Versus how much can it actually use based on constraints like I'm running out of capacity, or I have artificial constraints like limits and ready states and things like that. So that's the default. We think it's a good way to look at how you optimize capacity within your data center because it gives you a better understanding of the reality of how things are being used. But a lot of customers are using allocation model, have used them historically. I know I was a customer, used Excel spreadsheets. I didn't have tools like this available to me, but everything was based on allocation. I want 4-to-1 CPU ratio in my clusters. I never want to over allocate memory, storage. Maybe I am a little more generous on that, maybe 150% because I'm using some thin provisioning or something like that. But those are fixed, and then that's the way I figure out whether or not I can add more virtual machines to my environment based on that allocation. So my project planners and those types of people, very easy for them to understand. Very difficult for them to understand if they don't live in your world, how things work from a demand perspective. The problem with that model, strictly using an allocation model, as you can see, is that this cluster is showing a memory allocation bottleneck. So I've run out of memory based on the allocation model that I've set for that data center. But when I look at the demand for memory in that cluster, I can see that I'm really not using all the memory. I can get more efficient, or I can modify my memory allocation settings to be a bit more aggressive because I know how I'm actually using that capacity. So having both of these together, if you don't want to turn on allocation, you don't. It's by default, it's not turned on. If you want to turn it on, you just basically come in here and you set your allocation settings for CPU or memory or disk appropriately, and it'll show you both. The other thing that you'll notice on that chart is there's that blue cone of the predictions that I was talking about earlier, where we predict through that machine learning what that resource consumption is going to look like out to the next year. And we'll constantly modify and update that as we learn more about the behavior of the resource consumers. But there are two ways you can look at this. You can be aggressive or you can be conservative, and you can say, yeah, if I want to model my environment or I want to manage my capacity in a more conservative way, then I'll choose the upper band. So that's kind of the worst case scenario. If I want to be aggressive, then I'll just follow any of the recommendations that we make, any of the alerts, anything like that will be based on the prediction, the solid blue line, which is kind of mid-range of that prediction, that light blue prediction cone, I should say. Okay, so we look at this, we can look at some of the others, and you can see some of the differences here. For example, this central is, both constrained for memory and CPU by allocation and by demand. My production west data center, kind of same thing. I've got disk space allocation issue, but I've got plenty of disk space to go. Well, what can I do about this? If I look at production central, for example, and I go down here, it'll make a recommendation. It'll say, hey, you can add additional capacity to this environment to achieve longer runtime if you want to do that. Or if I'm doing strictly an allocation model and I want to see if there's any wasted capacity out there that I can reclaim, I can click on the reclaim option and it'll show me a couple of things. It'll show me for that production data center, the total of reclaimable capacity. So again, if I'm a planner that's looking at things from an allocation model, hey, I can get back 10 vCPUs, 20 gigs of memory, and 200 gigs of disk space. Sorry, my lab's real small. These may look larger in your environment. And it'll tell us, for example, too, I've got VMs that have reclaimable resources. I've got things like orphaned disks out there that can be cleaned up, and this will achieve some cost savings, mostly from the storage, reclamation. And then further down, it'll give you a list of those virtual machines, and you can actually, again, here's where you can take action directly from within this UI and not have to flip over to the vCenter UI. I can say, yeah, I would like to go ahead and delete all those powered off VMs. Those powered off VMs may actually be there for a reason. I worked in the financial industry and the banking industry, and we would actually power off VMs, but we had to keep them for legal hold purposes, for example. So you can say, well, I know they're there. I know they're kind of wasting space, if you will. I just exclude those. So you can click on this, and we won't consider those in that capacity reclamation that we give you. We look at idle VMs, we look at snapshots, and of course, orphan disks as well. And all of these are actionable except for the orphan disks, because there are some edge cases, some corner cases where an orphan disk may not actually be orphan. Things like VDI environments, or if you don't have all of your vCenters under vRealize Operations Management and you're using NFS storage between them, it could create some false positives. So we want to be very prescriptive, very careful. And so what you can do in this case is you can export a report that you can go and action and review later, and then delete those yourself.
Now, VMC is also a vCenter environment. Can I assume that that's also integrated into this? And if so, the cost models can be quite different, at times also based on regions, etc. Again, does that support VMCs as environments as well?
Yes, we do support VMC environments. Yeah, the cost models would be different for those. We do have some planning tools to show you, for example, how you can, if you migrate things from on-premises to VMC, what your resource consumption would be in VMC and what the costs associated with those VMs, how big of a VMC cluster you would need, that type of thing. So it is a bit different. So there are some things that don't, equate kind of one-to-one. But to the extent possible, yes, we do, support this kind of modeling with VMC.
And just curious, how does that cost get updated? Because those things change all the time, i.e. based on regions or, some optimization.
Yeah, so you can, we'll provide the published rates for any cloud providers, including VMC. We'll provide the published rates. If you've negotiated a discount, then you can input that discount into the model, and it will take that into consideration. So that's how we're getting it.
But it's manually done typically.
Well, the discount is. We don't know what your discount, so it's, yeah. But you don't have to go discount each line item. You just say, here's my overall discount.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so maybe I've reclaimed capacity and gotten kind of things back to where I need it to be. Maybe not. And the next thing that I may want to do is do some analysis to figure out, all right, I've decided I need to purchase more infrastructure. And maybe I'm doing that not because I'm running out of capacity, but because I need to onboard a new project. I'm adding a new application to the environment, and I need to know, what the impact of that is going to be on my data centers where I intend to place it. So in the what if analysis, we have cards for planning workload, either removing or adding workloads, physical infrastructure, adding more hosts and clusters. We have a model for adding HCI clusters. So for customers running vSAN, they can select that if they're looking at expanding vSAN clusters, and then the migration planning, which will be, hey, what if I decided to move this stuff to the cloud? So let's look at the workload planning first real quick, just to show you all these scenarios, the scenarios for the workload, the infrastructure, the HCI, they all kind of work the same way, so I won't go through each of them just in the interest of time, but I'll just say, onboard new application, and I'll select the data center. I'll do my production data center here. And let's say, well, I want to start off, I want to put that in central because, everybody in the company is going to access this application. I want it centralized. You can either put in the requirements for each of the VMs that will be within that new application, Or better, if you have an existing application that has the same, kind of workload, behavior, it's basically another instance of that application, I can just select existing VMs and add those to the model, and it will automatically figure out, how it's configured, what is the allocation and what is the demand, what kind of demand. And you can see the two here. So I've got the demand and the allocation for both CPU and memory, as well as the required disk space. And I can change the quantities here. So let's say this application is going to have, 6 front-end web servers, a couple of database servers for redundancy, and a couple of app servers for redundancy. Then I would select my project date. So, this application is going to be going on board or be installed towards the end of July. So I'll click the 27th. And then the end date, we can go out up to a year just for the prediction. That doesn't mean that the application would go away after a year, but it's just for the prediction purposes. After a year, because we are using that, the decaying of the exponential decay of the data that we get, after a year, it's a little hard to predict, much further out than that. So we run this scenario, and we'll get a return that says, yes, this will fit in the cluster that you want to put it into, or it won't fit. In our case, it won't fit. We have a deficit right now for CPU and memory. So what would be a cluster where it could fit? So I'll select any cluster, and we'll go, well, in that case, if you're open to that, then we can fit it in, and it'll come back in a minute and say, production east has room if you want to place it there, and your time remaining will be 140 days by adding this new workload. By the way, further down, we'll say, just throwing this out here, but if you want to do VMC, your cost per VM, for this application is $95 a month. Amazon, IBM, Azure, all the clouds that we support for the modeling. And you can click on this and get more detail about, what it is that where we get those recommendations from. Okay, and I like this model. I'll save the model, but I really want to do this in the central cluster. So what I'll do is I'll save this, and I'll run another model to figure out, okay, if I add capacity to the central cluster, will it give me the capacity that I need? So host to central. So again, I'll select my production data center, central, and then here it will select, it'll pop up and say, well, these are the current servers you're running. This is a nested environment. That's why it says make and model as VMware. But we have the ability to choose from basically any manufacturer that's on the compatibility guide. So I'll just stick with what we have. You can customize it too if you're doing white box servers, building your own, I guess. And we're going to, select the server first. And then we'll say, well, we're going to add 3 servers. And we can get those servers in, before the project goes online. We can get them in by the 13th. And again, you've got your end date there. We'll run that scenario. And in this case, it'll say, all right, well, this is going to be your cost for deploying those servers, and this is the capacity that you will get. So it'll increase your time remaining from 26 to 172 days. Well, that's great. But that's actually based on what the cluster is using now. So what I really want to do is combine those 2 scenarios together. So I can go to Save Scenarios, and I can say, give me that add host to central and onboard my new application, run those scenarios together. I get my time frame, so it overlaps slightly because I'm adding the host obviously before I add the VMs. Run the scenario. And then this is where I really get the benefit of the planning is, yeah, if I'm adding enough hosts or I need to select a different data center or whatever the case may be. Little bug here, so please ignore this. It's always fun to find. I actually found this bug doing a live demo for some of our other customers. That was a lot of fun. But your time remaining will actually increase from 26 to 153 days. And it'll show you, across the three resource areas, what that actually looks like. And so disk space is the one that's going to be running out. The model also shows you down here, the blue would be if you don't implement the project versus the green would be with the project servers added. So you can see they drop off after the, I think it was a 19th of September. That actually drops off. So you can actually see when adding and removing workloads would impact the model as well.
John, a question.
Yep.
This information is great for administrators if we have an ask for a new environment. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to generate a report of this information that perhaps more of an executive level view that you could take, to back up your ask if there's a new project, but maybe people who don't necessarily care about, exactly what, CPU you need or whatever, but just more of a high level view for a new ask. Is there a way to generate?
Like if we add this project, I need to buy X number of dollars worth of servers type thing.
It's great for, like I said, for administrators, you want to see a scenario for yourself, but you then need to take that information to the rest of the business and defend, why you're making certain requests. Is there a way to create a report based off that?
Not today. To create like this visualization, like to export it or anything like that. So not today, but it is something that we've heard from other customers as well. That
actually it could be nice if managers or internal customers that are planning to request resources for a plan or upcoming project could be allowed or enabled to check themselves if those resources are available before making the request.
Yeah.
And if not, trigger the process to procure those resources. Because what happens most of the time is that requests for allocation of resources are dumped on the operational teams that have to find ways to make it work, or eventually go and reclaim capacity after a certain point. So it would be nice if could be possible to integrate this into an enterprise process.
Yeah, and I think when you look at, I'm just checking the time here. I'm not checking my email. When you look at the kind of those cards that we have in the beginning of the 4 pillars, those are more or less based on user role, or what we call persona. And so ideally, because of the role-based access control that we have, you could give those people access to come in and do this type of planning. If it's a capacity planner, we would like them to come in and use this to validate, what they're doing, project planners and things like that. So that is one way to achieve that, is to give them direct access, and you could limit them to basically just doing these types of scenarios and not deleting VMs because they need more room.